Let me go over a few things here as we get started. You can see Charles Spurgeon. So we made maybe 120 or 30, and then I just made 75 of these other sheets. So you may have to look on someone next to you who has one. So Caleb's done a nice job the last couple of weeks. Here's some pictures. The nice thing now, into the 19th century, we are getting people who had actual photographs as that technology exists. And you can see down there what he looked like as a young man, and then his more famous pictures. He did, it doesn't always work this way, but smart move on the beard. That helped. And he also filled out a little bit as he got older. You can see the backside. We'll talk about these things. Of course, the one is just a sketching, but the others are pictures of the Metropolitan Tabernacle. You can see where he preached. It doesn't look like this anymore. It was burned down, then it was bombed out, but it still exists. We'll say more about that. And then this other sheet, I didn't keep that one. This other sheet, which some of you have, I'll just reference it. We don't have time to do detail. I found in my library, I forgot I had this book. This was given to me as a gift in 2016, February. My family and I lived, I'll put in quotation marks, lived, yes? Do you need one? Okay, I just saw a hand. We lived in London for 2 months. I say lived because you're not really living there, but it's a little more than just on a vacation. I did lots of preaching and some studying, but we were there for 2 months, and we lived really it was walking distance. We sometimes used the tube station right across the street, right where the Metropolitan Tabernacle was. I got this book in 2016 from someone that I think I had preached at their church. This is an original 1894, so this is a first edition. It's called Facsimile Pulpit Notes, and I just made a copy. This is what Spurgeon brought up into the pulpit. You see front and back, and this is probably blown up. It was probably just fit on one little half sheet of paper. And so this has facsimile of his sermon notes and then a printed sermon. His sermons are amazing. They still read well today. And it is amazing that he went into the pulpit with this. Now, I do appreciate it's very orderly, so you can see this is Acts 16, 33 through 34. And it says, here the gospel comes in contact with iron. In many cases, its work is slow, but not in this. And here are the points. Here is a person converted at once, subpoints. Here is a person confessing at once. Here is a person useful at once. Here is a person happy at once. And then you can see the 3 hymns that they were singing. That's what they had for the music minister, as you pick out your 3 hymns. So quite remarkable. Just keep this in mind when we talk about the amazing effect of Spurgeon's preaching. Many of you are familiar with Spurgeon. Maybe you've read a biography, a few notable ones. The Forgotten Spurgeon by Ian Murray. This is really a lot about his theological controversies and somewhat his biography. A book from 1984, Arnold Dallimore, C.H. Spurgeon. So new biography. I think you might have to buy a used copy on Amazon, but this is good. And a book that came out just last year. And if you're just going to read one biography of Spurgeon, this is of a reasonable length. And this is Alex DePrima. He's a senior pastor at Emmanuel Church here in Winston-Salem, not too far away, Baptist brother. And this is a good one-stop biography, under 300 pages, so it has sufficient information, but it's not going to overwhelm you. Several books you can read on Spurgeon. When Spurgeon was born, 10 days prior, a man you've already heard about in this class, William Carey, died in England, or died in India, and 10 days later, another Englishman, Charles Spurgeon, was born 1834, and his long-term influence would prove to be just as remarkable and in some ways just as global as William Carey. When Spurgeon died in 1892, he was a young man. He was only 57. As we've seen with people like Calvin, some others in this class, he probably worked himself to death, to an early grave. And he said at one point that the Lord's given me this constitution and I spent through the body he's given me in these years, and I would have done it the same all over again. From our vantage point, might say maybe there were some ways to extend your life, but he also had a life that was filled with physical suffering. When he died in 1892, he was undoubtedly the most famous Christian in the English-speaking world, and you could argue the most famous Christian in the world. He reached more people in the world with his weekly sermons than any other preacher up to that point in history. His body lay in state at his church for 3 days. 60,000 people came to pay their respects. 100,000 people attended services in his honor. A 2-mile-long funeral parade followed his casket from the church to the cemetery, and there were 100,000 spectators lining the way. Shops and pubs in London were closed. Flags were flown at half-mast. Although he was only 57 years old when he died, he had been, amazingly, a pastor for 40 years. So you do the math. He started early. And for most of those years, he pastored the largest congregation in the world. So before you want to say that all megachurches are bad, you just have to think about, well, what about Spurgeon? Now, none of us are Spurgeons, but he was. He was a man of undeniable natural and supernatural talents. At the same time, if you tell his life just as one of amazing success, you miss the times of intense physical pain, and he was very honest that he often suffered from deep emotional melancholy. Despite those challenges, or you might argue because of those challenges and God's grace to him, he was blessed by God with visible fruitfulness, the likes of which almost no pastor has ever seen. Now, almost everyone we're studying in this class has had some remarkable longevity in their influence and fruitfulness, but with the possible exception of George Whitefield, and then the last person I'll talk about in this class, Billy Graham. Of course, he's living in an age of radio and then television and then internet. I mean, Billy Graham lived a long time through a lot of different technology. 1918 to 2018, 99 years he lived. With a few possible exceptions, no one influenced more people, and certainly in his day was an absolute revelation. It's for good reason he is called the Prince of Preachers. Charles Spurgeon was born on June 19, 1834 in Kelvedon, Essex, in the area called East Anglia. Probably not very good at drawing a map of England here, forgive me, but I don't know. So, yeah, it's also like a character from the VeggieTales, but you know, there's the English Channel, and then here's some, I made Ireland and Skinny and Scotland, but you know, London is down here in the southeast, and over here east, and to the North Sea is the area of East Anglia, a very resonant Puritan area historically. You have Cambridge, which is sometimes counted a part of this East Anglia region, and then you have Spurgeon somewhere over here. He, at 18 months, went to live with his grandparents. Seems that because of economic difficulties, it was a better arrangement for him. His parents sent him to live with his grandparents. His grandfather, James Spurgeon, was a pastor in an independent meeting house, so think congregational, in Stambourne. He preached there for 54 years. Stambourne was a small village, fewer than 500 people. So you have to keep in mind, Spurgeon grew up in the country. still England, still British. Susanna, who he will marry, initially was not attracted to him and said he was very countrified. Some of my children resemble that remark, maybe some of you. He was very countrified. So it's hard to exaggerate the different worlds within one country that Spurgeon inhabited, from growing up in the country, rural, very countrified, small, to then living most of his life, not all that far away by miles, but culturally, in London, which is at this time the biggest city in the world. There's no bigger metropolis in the world than London. He was reared in a very pious home. He encountered the Bible, John Bunyan, Fox's Book of Martyrs, which he one time called, quote, the perfect Christmas gift for a child. Different era. Here's a book of Protestants killed by Catholics. You'll love it. Stocking stuffer. But he was very Puritan in his upbringing, a long line of nonconformists or dissenters. Remember that the Church of England is the state church, so if you are Baptist, Congregational, Presbyterian, Brethren, you are called a nonconformist or a dissenter, meaning you are not conforming, you are dissenting from the state church. Though he had this very pious upbringing, he wrestled with the Lord as a young man, struggling to find peace in his heart and comfort and peace of conscience. He felt his heart seemed blackened and his Bible reading was dull and he could not find the peace he desired. And he has a rather famous conversion story, which he would later tell and has been passed on many times. Sunday, January 6, 1850, at age 15, a snowstorm prevented Spurgeon from attending his own church. Incidentally, climate sort of people do think that the 19th century was a particularly cold era in the British Isles. You think Dickens stories with snow, and it's very uncommon that you have snow, but it does seem to have been a particularly cold. So he had a snowstorm that prevented him from attending his own church. He was visiting his parents in Colchester, which is in this same area there in East Anglia, on a break from school, and he couldn't go to his normal place, so he wandered off into a primitive Methodist chapel. That's the name of it. We're not insulting them. That was just the type of, we are real Methodists, primitive Methodists. It's interesting the names that people give to themselves or are given. When I was leaving General Assembly and Caleb was taking us, Chad Van Dixhoorn was in the car. We were taking these back roads from Chattanooga to the airport. I took a picture on my phone, and it was Second Greater Baptist Church. And I just thought, wow, that escalated quickly. Whatever the first one, this is the greater one that we're doing. Well, this was a primitive Methodist chapel. There were fewer than 15 people in the church. This is one of those great stories. You never know what God is going to use and how small and insignificant you may seem. We do not know the name of this preacher. He was uneducated, an itinerant preacher. Spurgeon later would say, likely it wasn't a very good sermon, but he preached from the text, "Look unto me, and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth." And at one point, that preacher looked right at Charles Spurgeon and said, "Young man, you look very miserable." And then he challenged him, "But you don't have to be. If you obey my text, you can be saved." Now, you can do that when there's 15 people in the church. Spurgeon later said, between 10:30 when I entered the chapel and 12:30 when I returned home, what a change had taken place in me. He then went and searched for a new church, and he landed at a Baptist church. So he wasn't raised Baptist, he was raised Congregational. And he wrote to his mother that he had gotten saved and become a Baptist. And she basically said, "I was praying for the former, but not for the latter." And Spurgeon, you see something of his wit. He said, "Well, God has done abundantly, immeasurably more than all you could ask or imagine." For him, that was being a Baptist. In the summer of 1850, he moved to Cambridge. Since he wasn't a member of the Church of England, think about this, you could not attend Oxford or Cambridge as a nonconformist. That's why there were all these dissenting nonconformist academies that would spring up around Oxbridge because he wasn't able to go there. Now, he received some tutoring and some education in and around Cambridge, but he could not himself go there. Almost immediately after his conversion, so he's converted 1850 when he's 15, and then that summer he moves to Cambridge, so now he's just turned 16 because he's born in June. Almost immediately he starts preaching. It's not normally what I would recommend a 16-year-old who's just been converted to start preaching, but it was different times. And if you say, well, but Spurgeon did it, my answer is going to be, are you Spurgeon? Because you're not, and I'm not. Immediately, parishioners noticed an unusual gifting. Of all the people, there's almost everyone in these 4 courses I would like to meet, but I really wish I could hear Whitefield and Spurgeon preach. And maybe it's the Lord's grace that they preached before all of their sermons would be on YouTube. Maybe we would only listen to that, or maybe we would be disappointed. Or maybe we would say, wow, he really was quite theatrical. But I just wish I could know, what did it sound like? Because from the very first time, it was evident he had natural gifts, would have been good at any kind of speaking, and then he had a supernatural unction from the Holy Spirit. In October 1851, so he's 17, he was asked to preach at a little church, again, not too far outside of Cambridge, called Waterbeach. And he was an absolute sensation from day one. He never received any formal theological training, which was unusual, even for that day, even for Baptists, to not receive any formal theological training. He preached for 2 years at this small rural congregation in Waterbeach, not far from the university. People came from miles away to hear him. He was absolutely a sensation from the very first sermon. At this time, he looked very youthful. He was pale and slim. Later years, he looked much older than he was, and he was not slim. But his sermons were robustly textual, and they had an old-time Puritan flavor about him. And as you see here, this is how he always preached. He studied himself full. So don't think this represents just flying off the seat of his pants. This represents studying. He was always a voracious reader. And I'll say more about his gifts in intellect and memorization. But he always went and had a simple outline and then mostly preached extemporaneously, which was much different than the leading preachers of the age, who gave very elegant, eloquent, learned discourses. He didn't preach anything like that. He pastored that church until an invitation came in November 1853 to preach at a historic Baptist church in London. The church was called New Park Street Church, or New Park Street Chapel. And this is where he would preach for the rest of his life. Now you may think, well, Metropolitan Tabernacle, isn't that his church? Well, they moved buildings and they changed the name, but he went, same congregation, to New Park Street Chapel. Only 19 years old, he's called to preach this, to pastor there in the part of London called Southwark. Learn that the Brits like to not pronounce W's in the middle of words. So it's not Southwark, but they say Southwark, just south of the Thames. And it was an industrializing area, a bit of a gritty area in the city. And the church there, New Park Street Chapel, had a long history with Baptist heavyweights, Benjamin Keach, John Gill, John Rippon. And it had once been a booming church of 1,200 people, but as the neighborhood changed, the church had declined, and when Spurgeon came in 1854, they were down to about 200 people on a Sunday, but it still had this reputation as this historic Baptist church. So he comes in 1854. By 1855, it is clear the church building cannot hold the crowds that want to come here. So it's still a fairly large church. It once had 1,200 people. Now it's down to 200. So it can grow some. But it's clear early on we cannot hold the crowds that want to hear this wonderkind. So they had to rent the Exeter Hall. That was a large gathering space used for concerts, philanthropic meetings, religious meetings, various societies, public gatherings. Opened in 1831, the main hall could seat 4,000 people. Spurgeon quickly filled Exeter Hall. Now he's very young. He is so young. 19, now 20. He often was criticized in the press. They said he was vain, and to be honest, he probably was in these early years. It would be very hard not to have some vanity as a 19 or 20-year-old and be preaching to thousands and thousands of people. It was a test that the Lord saw fit not to give me. He was dramatic, humorous, theatrical. I mean, even today, you can go back and read, and he just has a clever turn of phrase. He's funny. My favorite Spurgeon book, because I'm a pastor, are his lectures to my students. This is an old copy, and this really fits in about 2 volumes. This is squint print, which I can barely read anymore, but just gives you a taste for some of his humor. He's talking to ministers about praying. And he says, he's talking about not praying too long, which you say, go get him, Spurgeon, but he says too long would be more than 10 minutes. So you're like, oh, okay, well, different time. But he says long prayers either consist of repetitions or unnecessary explanations which God does not require, or they degenerate into downright preachings so that there is no difference between the praying and the preaching, except that in the one, the minister has his eyes shut, and in the other, he keeps them open. It is not necessary in prayer to rehearse the Westminster Assembly's catechism. It is not necessary in prayer to relate the experiences of all the people who are present. It is not necessary to string a selection of texts together and quote David and Daniel and Paul and Peter as thy servant of old. It is necessary to draw near to God. One little hint I cannot withhold: never appear to be closing your prayer and then start off again for another 5 minutes. It's exactly what he said. This whole thing is so good, and he had a natural sense of humor. He says, seldom do I hear a sermon, because he's always preaching, but when I do, I am grievously unfortunate. For one of the last sermons I heard, I was entertained with a justification of Joshua for destroying the Canaanites. And another sermon went to prove that it was not good for man to be alone. How many souls were converted in answer to the prayers before these sermons? I have never been able to ascertain, but I shrewdly suspect that no unusual rejoicing disturbed the serenity of the golden streets. That is very clever and very funny. Someone once criticized him for the humor he used, and he said, "Man, if you knew all the funny things that I don't say, you would be very pleased." Criticized him for smoking cigars. I'll come to that later. And he said, "Just be glad sometimes I smoke 2 cigars at once." He had a natural ability to connect, especially with common people. When he was a younger man, said he was more Harry Reeder than Kevin DeYoung. He moved a lot. Some of you who are here, Harry would move a lot. Well, he would sometimes run back and forth on the platform. He was very dramatic. And the press criticized him. Pastors criticized him. They said he was an attention seeker, uneducated. He demeaned the pastoral office and the church. And he probably in those early ages had some things to learn. But the crowds could not get enough of him. In 1855, he baptized a pretty and elegant woman in the congregation named Susanna Thompson, and 1 year later, Susanna and Charles would be married. They had a happy marriage, an honorable marriage. They went to Paris on their honeymoon. Within a year, they had twin sons, Charles and Thomas. Susanna, though she had a ministry, and she was famous for a book ministry that she collected of theological books to give to pastors and others, she was a semi-invalid for many years in their marriage, and Charles cared for her as best he could, even though, as we'll come to it, he suffered from excruciating pain, gout, arthritis, depression. Well, they were in the Exeter Hall, and they soon outgrew the Exeter Hall. And they moved to the recently completed Surrey Music Hall. These were some gardens. They had had a zoo, a menagerie, and then they enclosed this large rectangular building with a main floor and two wraparound galleries enclosed by a cast iron structure, seating for 12,000. It was the largest venue in London. The first Sunday in the hall was October 19, 1856. October 19, 1856. So he's obviously outgrown Sunday morning services at New Park Street. They're meeting here for the first time at the Surrey Gardens Hall. October 19, 1856 is a date that for Spurgeon would live in infamy, and a friend later said it even led him to an early grave all these years later. You may have heard the story. 10,000 people crammed into the hall, another 10,000 people outside trying to get in. Just for preaching. It's enough to make a preacher feel real good, but it's amazing. It's like today, some sporting events, some Taylor Swift concert or something, and it's Charles Spurgeon. Well, at one point, someone cries out, shortly after the service began, they yell, "Fire!" which caused a great panic. And in the stampede, in the confusion, 7 people died. And this plunged Spurgeon into a deep depression, the worst grief of his ministry. He later called it, quote, "the greatest ordeal of my life." Of course, people in the press were not very sympathetic. Well, what is he doing trying to preach to this many people? Why is he preaching in these arenas which are meant for public amusements? And his ministry has literally been the death. 20-some people were seriously injured. 7 died. The church returned to the Surrey Hall a few weeks later. So they did continue to meet. They resumed services in November. In 1857, Spurgeon preached to the largest assembled audience in his life. There had been a mutiny in India, so India is colonial possession of Great Britain, and there was a mutiny in India which called for a day of fasting and humiliation. So the government says we want a day of fasting and humiliation. This was a big public event, and so everyone wants to come and on this day of fasting for the nation, and they want to hear a sermon, and they want to hear from Spurgeon. And a crowd, and we have this exact number, these are the people that went through the turnstiles, 23,654, gathered in the Crystal Palace. So it's another venue to hear Spurgeon preach. It was the largest indoor congregation at that point that had ever assembled for preaching in the world. As far as we know, almost 24,000 people into the Crystal Palace to hear him preach. No microphones, no amplification. That's why he has a whole section on the physical strength you need to be a preacher. And he was blessed with a barrel chest. And he had a very loud, clear, distinct voice that could ring out to reach tens of thousands of people. There's also a famous story about a man later who recounted that he was converted even before that famous service took place. Spurgeon went in a day or two before the gathering to test out the acoustics, and he thought no one was in this massive amphitheater, and just testing the place, he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sins of the world. And unbeknownst to him, there were some workmen at various parts of the building, and one later recounted he thought God himself had thundered from heaven. And the Lord used it to awaken him and bring him to a sense of, I'm a sinner and I need the Lord Jesus Christ. They're just stories like that don't happen for everyone, but they did for Spurgeon and the anointing on his life. He had certainly an entertaining preaching style, but he was not an entertainer. He did not like big anthems in the church. Once, after hearing a special musical performance and being told that the music was sung, that music was sung by David himself, Spurgeon replied, "Then I know why Saul threw his javelin at him." A very witty sense of humor. He had an instinctive ability to communicate with people. He was also self-disciplined. He could concentrate in prayer and study. He has a whole section on lectures to his students about choosing a text. Here's the thing, because we think of Spurgeon as a great hero of expository preaching. And he was and he wasn't. You read his sermons, and they still read. I mean, you can still understand them. They still have humor. They're still edifying. They're not expositional in the same way you might be used to. They often are taking a phrase or a word, and he had such a brilliant mind and Bible connections. And he never preached what is called lectio continua, which is just what you all know, which is you preach through whole chapters, whole books. He didn't do that. So he has a whole lecture to his students on how to pick next week's sermon. And I want to say, Chuck, you could have saved yourself a lot of energy. Just do the next verse and the next verse. But he didn't. He said he wrestled with the Lord until a text would bite him. It was ready to grab him, and he would preach on it. He did not, though he had strong confidence, and he probably could be impudent as a young man, he did not let success corrupt him, as it often does. It did not make him feel entitled or cruel to those underneath him or lazy, but he developed a true humility, and partly in keeping with his rural upbringing, he had an allergic reaction to putting on airs. Just absolutely had no patience for that. And so he was never going to be someone who strutted around like a noble person of the aristocracy. That was not his upbringing, and he had no patience for it. And you just think about how much that class system was so dominant this is Victorian England, 19th century. If you don't know Victorian England, just think of a Jane Austen book you've read or a movie that you've watched. And he was allergic to all of that kind of pomp and circumstance. For 3 years, he preached in the morning at the Surrey Gardens Music Hall, and in the evening, he preached back at Park Street, very overcrowded. In 1861, then, they move into their new church, changed the name, Metropolitan Tabernacle. I think the official first name of Capitol Hill Baptist Church, many of you will know that in D.C., was Capitol Hill Metropolitan Baptist Church, which was given in homage to Spurgeon's Metropolitan Tabernacle. The leaders of the church had the foresight years before this to say, we're going to need a bigger church. And so they began collecting subscriptions, and they collected money rather quickly. And in this day, you still had people who would purchase seats or rent pews, and they could make money that way. And the congregation moved to the new Metropolitan Tabernacle I brought a tea towel, which I've never used. You'll recognize it. They moved to Elephant and Castle, which people debate where did that name come from. There was a pub at this intersection called Elephant and Castle. That symbolism, I remember my parents have a chess set where the rook is an elephant with a castle sort of on top of it. So you've seen an elephant in a cave. Well, this area of London is called Elephant Cave. Here's a nice tube map, so elegant. It's not exactly to scale, but so you can see here the Thames. If you're American, looks like the Thames, but don't say that. It's the Thames. And south of the Thames, this is Southwark. So when we lived with William and Janet Taylor, they were here a few years ago, and he pastored St. Helens, which is up here in the financial district. They lived down here. You can't really see it, but by this Borough tube station. And just down here, shamefully, it's cut off of this nice visual. Right here where this brown Bakerloo line and this black Northern line intersect, that's Elephant and Castle. So Elephant and Castle, and you can still go there today, and you can see Metropolitan Tabernacle, and there'll be a sign there that this was Spurgeon's church. It was built with very impressive Greek columns. Spurgeon said he wanted that because the New Testament was written in Greek. Okay, might not have chosen that design, but it makes sense. And the church, after his death, burned down. Fires were very common. It was rebuilt. About the only thing that survived was that front portico and those columns. And then during World War II, during the German Blitz, it was also most of it destroyed, and it was rebuilt again. Each time it was rebuilt with fewer and fewer seats, because you don't need as many seats as when Spurgeon was there. But you can still go there, Elephant and Castle, tube station, come out and see it. And the front of it still looks of course, it's surrounded by lots of things, but it still looks like this right here. It doesn't look like this on the inside anymore, but it still looks like this with these Greek columns. They moved into the church at Elephant and Castle, Metropolitan Tabernacle, fully paid for. It had seats for 3,600, but it could hold 6,000 when every last space was filled. It was the largest nonconformist church in the world. Now keep in mind, he is still only 26 when they move in there. When I tell people that I was called to be a senior pastor at 25 and I started at 26, back at my last church, URC, people usually think, wow, that was so young, and it's getting younger all the time. But I was not preaching to 6,000 person church, the most famous preacher in the country, maybe in the world. It is amazing the fruitfulness the Lord gave him, and he is yet just 26. Metropolitan Tabernacle was not traditional church architecture. It looked more like the halls he had preached in. It didn't have a traditional pulpit. He didn't like a traditional pulpit. Shame on you, Charles. He preferred a platform that he could move around in. Membership, when he first came to the church, was right around 200. By 1874, it stood at 4,366 people. He preached to 10,000 people each Sunday combined in the morning and the evening service. And according to one source, this is interesting, says that his church was the largest church in the world at the time. And this source says, you know what the second largest church was in the 1870s? It was the first African congregation in Richmond, Virginia. Black church in Richmond, Virginia, this source says, was the second largest church. So he was not only a preacher, but he was a pastor. It said, this boggles my mind, and I kind of want it to be true and not true, but I think it is true. It said he personally interviewed every person who joined the church. Most members were lower middle class, though the deacons in later years were eager to provide Spurgeon with private rail cars, with a paid vacation in France, favorite destination of wealthy Victorians. But he did marriages, burials, he had letters to attend to, so he wasn't just flying above the fray of pastoral ministry and just coming in and out to preach. He started a school. And I've read from some of that already, his lectures to students. A young man, during Spurgeon's first year in London, a man named Thomas Medhurst, was converted under Spurgeon's preaching. And then Medhurst started preaching in some of the hardest parts of London. But Medhurst was unlearned, uncultured. Spurgeon felt an obligation to help him. And soon, as people are converted and young men want to preach, they gather around Spurgeon and they want help. And so he starts the pastor's college. It was not a seminary that did Greek, Hebrew, systematics, church history. So this is not like old Princeton Seminary going on in America. Think of it more as a finishing school. And many of these men had little formal theological education, but he wanted men that he knew were converted, had gifts to preach, already had some success in preaching, and then this was a sort of finishing school to help you. You might think of it, most seminaries will have a biblical studies department and then a Christian thought department, which is theology, history, and then a pastoral theology. So this was kind of all pastoral theology department. Started with 21 students, grew to an average of around 100 students. But that's not all Spurgeon did. He opened almshouses for the poor, an orphanage, dozens of other ministries and philanthropic endeavors. In fact, at the celebration of his 25th anniversary in the church, his secretary made a list of 66 institutions and organizations that were started by Spurgeon. I don't know how much he's actually writing the charter for these things, but with his influence, with people that want to give money and that trust him, he was a kingmaker. And he had the ability to start new ministries, societies to distribute tracts, a mission to police officers, a temperance society, ironically. The blind, a mission to the blind, evangelism, a flower ministry, building and loan institution, a benevolent aid society, even a coffee house mission. He was so ahead of his time. He also formed dozens of missions in various parts of London. His most famous work was the Stockwell Orphanage that rescued over 1,500 children during Spurgeon's lifetime. Between 1865 and 1876, this book by Alex de Prima says, there were 62 new Baptist churches planted in London, and Spurgeon planted 53 of them. At the time of his death, nearly half the Baptists in London were in Spurgeon's church or churches that he had planted. He was a phenomenon from start to finish. But it's important to say he was also often sick. Sometimes had to be out of the pulpit for weeks or months. He suffered from gout, a kind of pain, arthritis, and for him it was often in his knees. He wrote, "What a mercy I have felt to have only one knee tortured at a time. What a blessing to be able to put the foot on the ground again, if only for a minute." It was exquisite pain. From the pulpit, this is what Spurgeon said, "I was racked with pain to an extreme degree so that I could no longer bear it without crying out. And I asked of the Lord, 'Wilt thou hide thy face from me, my Father?'" Sometimes he had so much pain in his legs, he was unable to leave his bed for days at a time. He said he would try to get comfortable and he would turn his side only to have the unfortunate experience that was even more painful than the place he had been resting. He said this pain often left me, quote, prostrate with depression. And considering he was British, don't think I'm stereotyping, not known to be overly expressive about their emotional state, and in the Victorian age, and a prominent figure, his level of transparency in making known his physical pain, his spiritual struggle, his psychological weaknesses must have been shocking. And I'm sure many ordinary people greatly appreciated it, and probably some in the upper echelon thought it was uncouth. He said, "I am the subject of depressions of spirit so fearful that I hope none of you ever get to such extremes of wretchedness as I go to." Some people in God's severe mercy, for any number of reasons, are given to what they would call a melancholy spirit. And Spurgeon himself used the language of depression. And it wasn't any one thing that drove him to it. It was the work, it was his pain. Sometimes he would get relief from the gout, and that would lift his depression. He learned that he needed more sleep. He learned that sometimes the best thing he could do was to find some sunshine and go on a long walk. In 1887, so we're coming now to his last years of his life, he published 2 articles in his magazine, The Sword and the Trowel, calling out theological decline in the evangelical church. He likened the evangelical church to a house that was being robbed, and he said, now is the time to be roused, to wake up, to go downstairs and meet the burglars face to face before they steal away our doctrines. He said, there are burglars in the house. They want to steal away the doctrine of inspiration, the doctrine of the atonement, the sinfulness of man, the sovereignty of God and salvation. The ensuing controversy came to be known as the downgrade controversy, because Spurgeon said that the church and his denomination in particular, the Baptist Union, was experiencing a significant downgrade. Well, most of his peers did not agree with Spurgeon, or if they did, they didn't share the same alarm, or they didn't agree with his tactics in raising these concerns. In October 1887, Spurgeon and the Metropolitan Tabernacle withdrew from the Baptist Union. This was a big deal. Your biggest church, most famous preacher, withdraws from the denomination. In December, the Baptist Union began an investigation of Spurgeon, and in January, they passed a vote of censure against him. So the most well-known preacher pastoring the biggest church in the world is censured by his, at that point, former denomination. Now, Spurgeon was certainly correct about these robbers, and yet, to be fair, Spurgeon was not perfect. He was not a great debater. He was prone. The things that made him brilliant in the pulpit did not make him great as a controversialist, lest we think that someone as gifted as Spurgeon must have been good at just every last thing. Well, often strengths in one area can be weaknesses in another. So, the things that made him so powerful as a preacher, zeal, maybe a sort of caustic wit and irony, a willingness to poke at people in high places. Even as some preachers are, he was apt to some exaggeration and overstatement. All of these things did not serve him well in theological controversy, which called for a more measured tone, a more careful, rather than a carpet bombing, a surgeon's scalpel. He rarely saw things in gray. It was always black and white. And though he was right about the doctrinal issues, he perhaps did not acquit himself as well as he could have. He was the world's greatest preacher. He was an admirable pastor. He was a below-average controversialist, and he was very poor at denominational politics. He was right, however. And he was not naturally drawn into conflict, so don't think that he was naturally polemical, but he had a nose for error. He was a committed Calvinist, believing in the total sovereignty of God. He defended all 5 points of the doctrines of grace. He thought that Arminians were right to want to uphold human responsibility, but he said from that right desire, they reasoned themselves into a number of unbiblical notions about free will. One author said his most frequent targets were Rome, ritualism, hypocrisy, and modernism. So the Catholic Church, ritualism, which could be high Anglican churches, hypocrisy, and modernism, these burglars coming in to take away these doctrines. Already in 1865, he observed that most people no longer believed in eternal punishment for the wicked. He was prepared, this is very instructive for us, he was prepared to be misunderstood in his own day because he believed that history and ultimately God would vindicate him. He said at one point, "We admire a man who stood firm in the faith 400 years ago, but if he does so in our day, he's likely to be deemed a nuisance and a bigot." Famous line, quote, "I am quite willing to be eaten of dogs for the next 50 years, but the more distant future shall vindicate me." Now, scandalous to some, this book by Arnold Dallimore, Baptist from Canada, of a more fundamentalist hue. It's a very good book. But you can tell when he writes it, he is just absolutely, he says, "I'm so sorry I have to bring this up, but scholarly integrity compels me to mention that he smoked cigars and he drank alcohol." He found cigars helped take some of the pain away, helped him sleep. He said, "If anybody can show me in the Bible the command, 'Thou shalt not smoke,' I'm ready to keep it, but I haven't found it yet." Now, it is different from, a pack of cigarettes today, these cigars, but he did like to smoke them. He famously said at one point, defending his practice, "I mean to smoke to the glory of God." And that became then just a banner, smoking to the glory of God. One time, early in the morning, he was walking with students, and several of them began to light up well before lunchtime their pipes and cigars. And Spurgeon said, "Well, isn't it a little early in the morning to be smoking?" And they shamefully put it away, only to have Spurgeon with a great big smile, pull out his own cigar and start to light it. As many affluent Brits did in the 19th century, he traveled to the south of France, hoping for warmer weather and sunnier skies to improve his health. He had Bright's disease, a name given to chronic kidney disease, often associated with high blood pressure, heart disease. And his deacons had sent him away to Menton, France. And at the end of 91, so winter of 1891, they send him away to France for some sunshine and recuperation, and he never returns home. He dies in France on January 31st, 1892. They mourned him in France and then sent his body back to England. It reached London on Monday, February 8, to much fanfare. More than 100,000 people attended a series of services at the Tabernacle. Before Spurgeon left for France, he had arranged for Arthur T. Pearson, A.T. Pearson, to fill the pulpit. He was an American, a Presbyterian from Philadelphia, and he was friends of Spurgeon. And Spurgeon trusted him so much that he called on him to come and to fill his pulpit. Well, after he died, A.T. Pearson continued to fill the pulpit for another 2 years, and there was some controversy in the church whether they continue with A.T. Pearson or others wanted to bring Charles Spurgeon's son, Thomas, who was in New Zealand, to come and to be the preacher. Well, A.T. Pearson was probably a better preacher and had a bigger reputation. He had 3 things against him, however. 1, he was a Paedo-Baptist, so that was going to be hard to work long term. 2, he was a dispensationalist. Strangely, at this time, many Presbyterians were dispensationalists. You know where one of the first meetings for the Schofield Reference Bible took place? Grove City College, strangely enough. And the biggest strike he had against him is he was not Charles Spurgeon's son. So they voted after 2 years to bring Thomas Spurgeon to fill in his father's shoes, and he did so faithfully, though not with anywhere near the fruit. In 1898, as I mentioned, most of the church building was destroyed by fire, and it was rebuilt. The church was bombed by the Germans in World War II. It was rebuilt again, smaller still. By 1965, the congregation had shrunk. One observer said you could fit the whole congregation in only a few pews. In 1970, they called Peter Masters, who had been a member at Martin Lloyd-Jones' Westminster Chapel and had been a pastor north of London. They called Peter Masters to be the pastor at Metropolitan Tabernacle, and amazingly, he still is, 55 years later. So he's, how young was he when he started? Well, he's in his 80s now and has had a very conservative, Orthodox, evangelical ministry there to several hundred people. So there is a gospel witness, in Metropolitan Tabernacle. We can be grateful for that. What lessons, as we bring this to a close, what lessons can we draw? And in particular, I want to think, why was Spurgeon so successful? Or to put it another way, why were so many people? I mean, this was unheard of. Why did tens of thousands of people want to hear Spurgeon preach? When he came to New Park Street, the membership was 232. In 1891, over 14,000 people had been baptized during his years, and the church had a regular membership of 5,311, and many more than that, 10,000 between morning and evening services on a Sunday. Now, there were other large churches in London, but none as large as Spurgeon's. He was unique. He had a style that was arresting, appealing to the masses. I'm trying to think of an analogy. You might think of it like a plain-spoken but brilliant, funny, dynamic, tell it like it is, step on your toes preacher from West Virginia coming to New York City, and yet he's so smart and he's so gifted, people just have to listen to him. Dallimore says, quote, he was of medium height. Now this is where, you can't choose your biographers usually. He was of medium height and not of an attractive build. His body was short in the upper leg. Wow, I didn't know I had to worry about my upper leg. But he possessed an orator's powerful chest. His head was large, and it was said, this is a great euphemism. Now, I don't want you to say if it's true of you or anyone you know. It was said, there were no angles about him. No angles. It's all curves. In his early 30s, he grew a beard, which was a good look for him. He did work himself to death. It was a time of great confidence in Britain. Queen Victoria sat on the throne 1837 until 1901, the longest reigning monarch until Queen Elizabeth II just kept on going. Queen Victoria set a tone for moral rectitude. This is when Britain ruled the seas, expanded its empire, grew in economic prosperity. It was a time of great confidence for Britain. The state religion is the Church of England. The culture in Victorian England was, at least on the surface, very Christian, Protestant. You might say that the country was ready for old-fashioned doctrine presented in a fresh, engaging delivery. He thrived in a context. It's important because we don't get to choose the times in which we live, and God has different callings for us. He thrived in a context where people were at least nominally Christian, assumed a basic Christian morality, and had a working knowledge of the Bible. I mean, he's preaching to working class people, most of them, and you read his sermons, and he's just a dizzying array of biblical allusions. But he could assume that somewhere in their education, they learned most of these things. Now, many people thought he was a circus performer, a sensationalist, a clown, even a buffoon. He wasn't those things, but he was theatrical. One man said he was, quote, dramatic to his fingertips. He was not high and refined like many Anglican preachers. He was ordinary and accessible. We might have even found him overly emotional, sentimental, maybe even melodramatic at times. But of course, this is all looking for mere human explanations. The truest explanation is that he preached with a great unction, power, and with an unusual blessing from the Lord. And he was a pious man. He knew his Bible. He loved his wife. He was a good father. Not everyone we've looked at here has been an admirable husband and father. He was. There was no hint of moral impropriety. One of his best American friends, H.J. Hines, yes, that Hines, the pickle ketchup Hines, a Christian, visited the tabernacle whenever he was in England, and he said about Spurgeon, quote, he is the most humble man I've ever known. This is brilliant, and I hope you all note this. Once when an American visitor asked Spurgeon for the secret to his success, you ready? He simply replied, my people pray for me. My people pray for me. The complete works of his sermons now run to 63 volumes. He was not a theological writer per se. He was not an academic. 3,563 sermons in these volumes, and more are being discovered. Newspapers printed his sermons weekly, sometimes daily. Well over 100 million weekly sermons were sold during his lifetime to people all over the world. He was a voracious reader. Though not formally trained, he probably, people say, do you have a photographic memory? I absolutely do not. I remember things, but I don't really. I mean, very few people do. He really did. He could digest everything. He could read and go into the pulpit with those short notes, and amazing. Not a model for most pastors. He would not begin to write down his notes until Saturday evening, and he prepared his Sunday evening sermon notes on Sunday afternoon. Not good for us mere mortals. He was in the largest city in the world, and you recall there were fewer activities on Sunday back then, especially if you were pious, wanted to honor the Sabbath. You didn't have TV, radio, internet. There were theaters and concerts, but it wasn't yet an era of big sporting events. If you wanted to be a part of something big, there weren't that many options, and there was nothing bigger going on than Charles Spurgeon. And yet, that's not the ministry that most of us will be called to have, pastor or not. One person put it very well. Here, I'm done. He said, Spurgeon was put into a context where he was given a ministry of reaping, of harvesting. What seeds had been sown and watered and sunshine had grown and prayers, where many others are given a ministry of simply sowing, or even a ministry of prophetic hardening. But he was given a ministry of reaping, of a harvest. There was a Christian consensus and expectation. Sunday church attendance was the norm. The danger, of course, when all that is true, is Christianity can be too fashionable, too respectable, too at home in the world. Above all, and here I'll leave you, Spurgeon's ministry shows the continuing power of preaching. At one of the memorial services, the president of the Wesleyan Conference, Dr. Stevenson, made this observation. With that coffin before us, none of us can doubt that the pulpit is the power in the world still, that still, by the foolishness of preaching, God is pleased to save men.